By request, this deck build will look at a somewhat pure version of artifacts that is not supplemented by Fire and Ice Hand or any Trap Trick monsters. Artifacts right now have trouble standing on their own due to a lack of quality cards to trigger their somewhat unique method of action, and any strategy that relies on the opponent to trigger those effects tends to be too inconsistent. While in the past, artifacts could be a nasty surprise for the opponent, the sad reality in the modern meta is that this surprise has become power creep to the point where the opponent probably isn't concerned with the consequences. Basically, the opponent should not be afraid of any artifact, sans Scythe or Moralltach, and neither one of those effects is that dangerous. For when the opponent is going to launch an attack, the board is already set up, so potentially triggering Scythe's effect off a blind MST or back row removal is of little consequence for the opponent. They've already made their extra deck plays. Scythe's power largely comes from your own triggering of its summons via Sanctum or another card, not the opponent just blindly MSTing it before they've even made any of their plays. While Moralltach's effect can still be annoying, it is far less detrimental than, say, running headlong into a mirror force. So once your opponent has set up their board, there's little fear of them just saying, okay, I have the capacity to remove your back row. They might be artifacts, but hey, I can deal with those artifacts. I'm not concerned about them because their power relative to my board is so limited. This lack of fear, at least in my eyes, limits the value of hiding cards like Mirror Forces and other Mirror Force type cards amongst the artifacts in an attempt to net large scale minuses against the opponent. In the past, that was a critical tempo shifting strategy that helped your artifact decks survive. Now, I just don't think that strategy works anymore. Another concern with this deck is a lack of tempo due to the level 5 standing of all artifact monsters. So there will be a considerable number of monsters in your deck that you just can't simply normal summon to help expand playmaking. Therefore, the deck needs to have tools to compensate for this lack of immediate explosiveness of artifacts. So with those concerns in mind, let's go to the deck build. For the artifact monsters, I like running 3 copies of Scythe, which has become the most important artifact, supplanting Moralltach, due to the importance of extra deck summoning for a lot of other decks. 3 copies of the newly freed from the ban list Moralltach as the key card popper, 2 copies of Beagalltach to act as one of the many triggers for the other artifact summoning. I find 3 copies can be a little much for the deck creating inconsistencies. You end up with all these things that can pop artifacts, but not artifacts. And finally, 2 copies of Caduceus for the draw effect, because this deck can run out of resources somewhat quickly with mass artifact setting and popping. Regarding the other artifacts, I do not like Labby, for it just does not do enough to change the tempo of the game, as 2300 attack is too little, and it has no secondary effect either through any special summons or its artifact-based summons. Okay, I put it on the field, but yay? I mean, I guess it's a 2300 wall, but it really doesn't change the tempo, momentum, or swing the duel in any capacity towards my favor, and that's just another card from my hand. Fallout does not do enough because one of the things that artifacts certainly lack is a continuous means to trigger artifact effects. So continuously recycling those artifacts back to your spell or trap zone, unless you have another means to hit it, not that big of a deal, and your opponent's going to know, oh, that one's an artifact. I'll stay away from that one. If the artifact deck ever got a more continuous means to trigger these effects, then a pair of foul knots would be suitable because it does not include itself. But that's not the case. Chakrams effect is just too weak to have any real value, even with maybe a Worky treasure map potential combination. The problem with Varja is most of the other artifact monsters are not good, which limits the value of the explosiveness that its effect can produce. However, 1 copy can still be useful. I choose not to run one, but due to Sanctum's searching effect, one copy is certainly viable. Lancia is a near staple side deck card, but in a pure build does little to support its artifact brothers and sisters. Too bad it didn't receive some secondary effect when tributed from the field, which could have provided some actual reason for summoning it. So I dump it from my hand, you can't banish anymore. If I tribute it from my field, you can't banish for the rest of the turn, and I get something else, like draw 2 cards maybe or something. Sadly, that's not the case. Shield and Aegis can both be useful at one copy, but for me, they just don't do enough to be useful most of the time. You typically want to summon Scythe or Moralltach over either Shield or Aegis. In the past, both were better, but in this day and age of Yu-Gi-Oh, they've just suffered from significant power creep. They're cards that say, oh, you can maybe only put 1 or 2 monsters on the field. Oh, I can put these guys on, maybe stall you out for a turn, come back to my turn, now I can make some plays. Now, though, with the meta of, oh, many decks that can just spit out 4 to 6 monsters in a given turn, they can find ways to easily play around there. For the spell and trap artifact support, 3 copies of Ignition and 3 copies of Sanctum are relative no-brainers for this pure build. While still rather powerful, Sanctum has unfortunately lost some usefulness since the release of Red Reboot, for opponents will simply pay half their life points to prevent Scythe from hitting the field. Unleashed is another one of those cards that should have done more, for as it is now, it is just an inferior copy of Wonder XZ. Overall, Unleashed should have been a continuous means to trigger artifacts as a continuous spell or trap that allowed you to destroy one of your back row, say to summon a token or banish a card from the opponent's graveyard. Heck, even such an effect would have fit the name. Unfortunately, Unleashed was instead, not mincing words, a pile of garbage. Looking at the rest of the monsters, to those who are familiar with my deck builds, not surprisingly, Pure Artifacts does have a normal summons hole, and when I run decks that aren't pure meta, that have normal summons holes, of course I like to run 3 copies of Fairy Tale Luna and 1 copy of Fairy Tale Snow. Luna is, as always, a strong card for going either first or second. It can help support Scythe and Moralltach's interruption effects when going first, or can help wound board, so to speak, when going second, giving you a chance to fight back. Also, due to the incredible importance of Sanctum in this deck, I think running 3 copies of Lilith, Lady of Lament, is useful for adding additional search power for Sanctum. Overall, I feel Lilith either should have searched 3 differently named traps, or you needed to have Lair on the field for it to get its effect. But hey, I guess Artifacts could take advantage of Konami's generosity in that design. Score 1 for Artifact. I like running the 1 allowable copy of Tour Guide from the Underworld. Because this deck has a little trouble going second, this is one of those times where even I will admit that hand traps are a must. I run 3 copies of Droll and Lockbird and 2 copies of Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, although obviously running Ashes and Effect Veilers are good choices as well. Finally, closing out the monsters, I like 1 copy of Eater of Millions as a means to remove high attack power monsters, which this deck can have some problems getting over, and 5 monsters from the extra deck is no problem for this particular deck. It is worth noting that while Thunder King Ryo is definitely a nice card, I feel it really only works going first, and its job is somewhat overlapped by Scythe's effect, for while both effects tend to travel different routes, they tend to reach the same destination, heavily handicapping your opponent from doing anything. For the remaining spells, I run my standard 1 copy of Raigeki, 1 copy of Upstart Goblin. Also, I run 3 copies of Pot of Duality, for special summoning during your turn is not a common event in a pure artifact build, and ironically to that point, I run 1 copy of Instant Fusion to provide some extra deck versatility to board break by bringing out something like a Thousand Eyes Restrict or a Invoked Raijin, or to supplement rank 5 XE playmaking via Panzer Dragon. Overall, while it is popular in other artifact builds, I don't like double Cyclone in this deck because it isn't always live. Cyclones could be a side deck choice when facing down a field spell heavy deck like ABC or even Spiral, but as a main deck option, it is just too inconsistent for my taste. Instead of double Cyclones, I run the understandable 2 copies of Heavy Dust. I also run 1 copy of Solemn Judgment and 1 copy of Torrential Tribute to help quick play board clearing. Some may wonder about the lack of some more generic draw power in either Card of Demise or Pot of Desires. I definitely don't like Pot of Desires in this deck because if you lose 2 or even all 3 of your scythes, well, that is quite the problem because this deck will commonly not win just with only one single turn lockdown in the opponent's extra deck unless you're just ridiculously lucky. Card of Demise is tough for this build because of the hand traps and some more of the normal summons choices in Luna and Lilith. Most artifact builds that support Demise run a little more heavy on artifacts or a little less heavy on non artifact monsters, but I just feel that breeds some level of inconsistency due to the lack of quality summons for artifacts, and overall, just you don't have enough monster board presence. Overall, outside of the various rank 5s, the extra deck is of little consequence. I run 1 Invoked Raijin, 1 Panzer Dragon, 1 Darkfire Dragon, 1,000 Eyes Restrict, giving all that versatility there to instant fusion, 1 Scarlight Red Dragon Archfiend, 1 PSY-Framelord Omega, 1 Gaia Dragon the Thunder Charger, 1 Tiras Keeper of Genesis, 1 Constellar Pleiades, 1 No. 61 Volcasaurus, 1 Artifact Durandal, 1 Tornado Dragon, 1 Gaga Cowboy, pretty much any rank 3 you want to run when you combine a Lilith and a tour guide. I choose Phantom Knight of Break Swords, but something like number 47 Nightmare Shark can be a good choice as well. And 1 Link Karibo for the Thousand Eyes Restrict. If you can't afford the Link Karibo because they're still kind of pricey, just throw in either a DCS for maybe enhancing your synchro playmaking or another level 8 synchro. Overall, while this build is more geared towards not knowing whether you're going to go first or second, so to give it a chance to actually fight back if you end up going second, if one does want to gamble with a go first or bust mentality with the Scythe shutdown strategy, this is another build towards that idea. The biggest change is no Lunas. Instead, Curry Bandit takes those spots with the idea of dumping a Scythe to the graveyard with that 5-card mill and hopefully grabbing a Trap Revival card or a Sanctum. Of course, the Curry Bandits are there to set up for your next turn, your second or your third Scythe, because obviously their effects activate during the end phase, although they can be useful for potentially dumping a Scythe to the graveyard so that it's there to be revived if you have a Call of the Haunted or a Back to the Front in your hand to start with. Second, lots and lots of draw power, sans Pot of Desires for concerns about losing those scythes. Obviously, the goal of this deck is to go first, hit the opponent with Scythe number 1 on their first turn, Scythe number 2 on their second turn, and if necessary, Scythe number 3 on their third turn, and really hope they don't have anything that can negate Scythe's effect. Of course, with this build, if you go second, you hope the opponent bricks. In the end, it is rather easy to see why artifacts are heavily favored as an engine versus being its own archetype. They do have some issues as their own deck. First, as mentioned, despite there being a suitable number of artifact monsters, most of those monsters were actually never really that useful, and the ones that were useful outside of Scythe and Moralltach once upon a time have now been rather power creep. it is basically a stall or interruption deck that you have to stall your opponent out 2 or 3 times and then hopefully you win because your opponent will definitely outgrind you. And unfortunately, this stall or interruption strategy, again, is really just achieved by 2 cards, Scythe and Moralltach, leaving the rest of the artifacts out in the cold. The deck is significantly hurt by the lack of any type of continuous means to trigger artifacts over multiple turns, a card that might have also netted you some additional positive effects. Fortunately, artifacts seem to be a very back burner archetype slash deck right now in a lot of people's eyes. Most people are comfortable with them as an engine. The 2 or 3 scythes, the 2 or 3 Moralltachs, the 3 sanctums, done and done. We don't need this deck to get any more support. So these issues with the deck as a pure build probably will never be resolved. Therefore, when looking at the deck as an archetype, I feel maximizing the stall and interruption capacity is of first and foremost importance. I attempt to achieve this strategy with the obvious hand traps and with the Luna Lilith combination. While I like this build more than the others I've tested, one concern is that it does not have a lot of raw power that can consistently hit the field. Usually you're kind of relying on either Sanctum or Luna to provide that power. Sanctum bringing out Moralltach or Scythe, and the Lunas continuing just to search other Lunas and flopping down those Lunas once per turn, every turn for 3 consecutive turns, in addition to that snow. But this lack of power definitely can be troublesome when the opponent has time to set up, or they just have a lot of raw power in something like Blue Eye. Fortunately, though, for Artifact pure decks, the seemingly demise of True Draco and Masterpiece has given them a slight boon, because the True Draco matchup was almost an auto loss. Well, that is my Artifact deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.